The United States Senate just voted to hand over one of its most sacred constitutional powers. And what's staggering isn't just the vote itself. It's that almost nobody in power seems bothered by what it means. 47 senators voted to reassert Congress's authority over war. 53 voted to let it slide. And buried inside that count are two names that tell you everything about where American politics stands right now. One Republican crossed the aisle to vote with Democrats. One Democrat crossed the aisle to vote with Republicans. And the fallout from this single vote could reshape how America enters conflicts for decades to come. So let's break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and what almost every cable news network is glossing over. The vote in question was on a war powers resolution. Now, if that phrase sounds like Washington jargon, here's what it actually means in plain terms. A war powers resolution is Congress's way of saying, hold on, you don't get to send American troops into combat without our approval. It's rooted directly in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, explicitly gives Congress, not the President, the authority to declare war. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 was passed specifically because presidents kept finding ways around that requirement, dragging the country into conflicts without a formal vote. This particular resolution aimed to block what multiple lawmakers are now calling an unlawful military operation against Iran. And when the votes were tallied, it failed. 47 to 53. Now here's where it gets interesting. Republican Senator Rand Paul broke with his party and voted in favor of the resolution, siding with Democrats. Meanwhile, Democratic Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania voted against it, siding with the Republican majority. That crossover on both sides tells you this isn't a clean partisan issue. There are fractures in both parties. But the bottom line is this: the Senate chose not to assert its constitutional role. And now the resolution heads to the House, where a vote is expected shortly. But even if the resolution fails there too, this vote matters, because it puts every single member of Congress on the record. And that record is going to matter more than most of them realize. Here's a number that should stop every political strategist in Washington cold. When the Iraq War began in 2003, public approval for that conflict stood at roughly 70%. Over the years, as the war dragged on, that number eventually cratered to around 42%. It took years of mounting casualties, revelations about weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, and trillions in spending before the public fully turned against it. Now consider this. According to recent polling, the current military operation against Iran launched with an approval rating of just 41%. Not after years of disillusionment, from the very start. The American public is less supportive of this conflict on day one than they were of Iraq at its lowest point. That's not a small detail. That's a 5-alarm signal for anyone who voted to let this operation continue unchecked. And yet senators like Susan Collins of Maine, who is up for re-election, justified her vote against the resolution by arguing that pulling back now would send the wrong message to Iran and to American troops. She stated that providing unequivocal support to service members is critically important at this juncture. But critics, including Graham Plattner, a veteran and Democratic Senate candidate running against Collins in Maine, fired back immediately. His response was blunt. He questioned how, within days of the operation starting, the argument had already shifted to, well, we can't stop now. He compared it directly to the logic that kept the United States bogged down in Iraq for over a decade, and warned that the same people who learned nothing from that disaster are making the same arguments all over again. That comparison is going to haunt this debate. And what's happening with the messaging around this conflict makes it even more concerning. There's a deliberate strategy unfolding right now among supporters of this military operation, and it mirrors a tactic the world has seen before. The instruction coming from leadership, according to multiple reports, is simple: do not call it a war. Republican Congressman Mike Flood was asked directly before the House vote whether he considers this a war. His answer was carefully rehearsed. He called it a significant military operation. Not a war, a significant military operation. If that phrasing sounds familiar, it should. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin's government insisted it wasn't a war. They called it a special military operation. The parallel is hard to ignore, and multiple analysts have already drawn the comparison. Meanwhile, House Speaker Mike Johnson has taken the messaging a step further. He's argued that the American people will politically reward those who supported this action. He stated that history will record that the administration did the right thing, and that passing a war powers resolution would empower enemies and kneecap American forces. Johnson has also signaled that Congress will move to pass a war funding supplemental, with estimates suggesting around $50 billion in additional spending. $50 billion. That's money that multiple lawmakers have pointed out could fund expanded health care, housing programs, or infrastructure. Instead, reports indicate it will go toward munitions and operational costs for a conflict that most Americans didn't want in the first place. But the constitutional arguments being made on the House floor are what really deserve attention, because members from both parties are making the case that this goes far beyond Iran. Democratic Congressman Joaquin Castro laid it out in stark terms during the House debate. He pointed to statements from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who reportedly told lawmakers that Israel was preparing to strike Iran, and that such a strike would have triggered Iranian retaliation against American forces in the region. Castro's argument was direct. Rather than telling Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to stand down, the administration chose to join the conflict preemptively. Castro asked how that qualifies as America first, and reminded the chamber that for 25 years, a generation of American service members and their families have already sacrificed enormously because of regime change wars in the Middle East. Congressman Jim McGovern went further. He told the House that he attended the classified briefing and stated there was no evidence of an imminent threat from Iran. He accused Republican leadership of cycling through justifications, shifting from imminent threat to regime change to nuclear concerns and back again within a 24-hour span. McGovern compared the situation directly to the lead-up to the Iraq War, saying he still remembers the lies about weapons of mass destruction. And he added a point that cut deep. It won't be the children of billionaires or politicians going to fight. It will be working-class kids putting their lives on the line. But here's what makes this different from a typical partisan fight. It wasn't just Democrats raising alarms. Republican Congressman Thomas Massie delivered one of the most forceful constitutional arguments against the operation from the Republican side of the aisle. He cited the 1973 War Powers Resolution directly, outlining its 3 conditions under which a president may introduce armed forces into hostilities. First, a declaration of war. Second, specific statutory authorization from Congress. Third, a national emergency created by an attack on the United States. Massie argued that none of those conditions have been met. Iran has not attacked the United States. Congress has not declared war. And Congress has not granted specific authorization. But Massie didn't stop at the legal framework. He asked the practical questions that are resonating with millions of Americans right now. How does this conflict help families in his district pay for groceries? How does it make their neighborhoods safer? How does it help them afford housing? He pointed to the cumulative cost of Middle East interventions, citing estimates of at least $8 trillion spent across Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan. And he warned that a sustained conflict with Iran will not stabilize the region, but instead radicalize new generations, ignite further instability, and send waves of refugees into Europe and the United States. Massie also highlighted something the administration has struggled to address consistently. The rationale for the operation keeps shifting. The president stated that an Iranian strike was imminent. The Department of Defense reportedly conceded there was no evidence of an imminent strike. Some officials pointed to nuclear weapons concerns, while others referenced earlier operations that supposedly neutralized Iran's nuclear capabilities. Secretary Rubio suggested Israel forced America's hand. Massie argued that this inconsistency is precisely why the Constitution places war authority with Congress, not with a single individual in the executive branch. And Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin drove that constitutional point home in a way that left very little room for rebuttal. Raskin addressed the argument that several Republican colleagues had been making, the idea that since the president has already committed forces, it would be counterproductive for Congress to assert its authority now. Raskin called this a self-defeating argument. He warned that if any president can unilaterally plunge the country into a conflict and then use the existence of that conflict to argue Congress can't intervene, it effectively destroys Congress's war powers permanently. The framers of the Constitution, Raskin argued, placed this authority with Congress deliberately because they understood that kings and executives throughout history had repeatedly dragged nations into wars based on deception, imperial ambition, and personal calculation. The decision to put American sons and daughters at risk, he stated, is an awesome, solemn responsibility that must be vested in the representatives of the people. Senator Adam Schiff, who co-introduced the resolution alongside Senators Tim Kaine, Chuck Schumer, and Rand Paul, echoed the precedent concern. He argued that if Congress fails to act now, it sends a message to this president and every future president that they can launch military operations whenever they want, wherever they want, for whatever reason they want, without congressional constraint. Schiff called that dangerous to both the American people and to the troops themselves. And then there's the assessment from Senator Mark Kelly that might be the most damning of all. Kelly, a former Navy combat pilot and astronaut, stated bluntly that you could assemble a random group of people off the street in Washington, and they could probably do a better job managing this situation than the current administration. His reasoning was straightforward. There is no clearly defined goal, no strategic plan, and no timeline. Without those elements, Kelly warned, the most likely outcome is a prolonged conflict with significant American casualties and no clear benefit to the American public. Hit subscribe right now if you want the truth without the corporate filter. We cover what they won't every single day. Turn on notifications so you never miss when we expose the next major story. Do it now. Meanwhile, the justifications coming from the administration's own spokespeople aren't helping. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was asked why the president ordered the military strike when he did. Her response, according to reports, was that the president had a good feeling about the timing. A good feeling. When pressed for specifics or intelligence backing, the answer reportedly remained vague. For an operation that has already cost American lives and could cost billions more, A good feeling is an explanation that is unlikely to satisfy the families of service members deployed overseas. On the other side of the argument, Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin framed the conflict as a historic opportunity. He called it the best opportunity of his lifetime for geopolitical change. But critics immediately pointed out the contradiction. Americans are struggling with health care costs, housing affordability, and education funding. Framing a military conflict that most voters oppose as an opportunity disconnects from the reality facing millions of families. And the question of a new War Powers Act is now gaining traction. Graham Plattner, the veteran and Senate candidate from Maine, has argued that the entire framework needs to be overhauled. Under current law, a president can initiate combat operations and only needs to notify Congress within 48 hours, with up to 60 days of operations before requiring formal approval. Plattner is calling for a system where military force must be approved by Congress before it begins. No grace period, no retroactive justification, congressional authorization from the start. So where does this leave things? The Senate vote failed. The resolution now moves to the House, where the debate is already underway. But regardless of the outcome, something significant has already happened. Every member of Congress is being forced to go on the record about whether they believe the Constitution still means what it says about war powers. Every vote will be documented. Every justification will be remembered. This isn't just about Iran. This is about whether the American system of checks and balances still functions when it matters most. The framers designed a system where no single person could commit an entire nation to war. That system is being tested right now. And based on what we've seen so far, a majority of the Senate just decided they're comfortable letting that system erode. The approval numbers tell you where the public stands. The congressional speeches tell you that members on both sides of the aisle recognize the constitutional crisis unfolding. The question now is whether any of that will translate into action, or whether this becomes another moment where Washington talks and then moves on, while the consequences fall on the people who can least afford them.